Fellas, I feel like the BMF belt is going to become a more disguised version of the interim belt in these next few years and months of the UFC. I just think it's going to become a placeholder belt as well. I feel like the original concept of the BMF belt was to, put two fighters who are going to put on a banger fight against each other. Whereas I feel like now the UFC are kind of using it to their advantage, and you'll see why I've touched on multiple topics in this video, why I think, or what I think is going to happen to the BMF and what I think should happen. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on the BMF belt as a whole. Is it a good belt? Is it terrible? But the first thing I'm going to say is, obviously, we've seen it a few times. We saw it with Masvidal and Diaz. Now, this was exciting when it first came around with Masvidal and Diaz because it was the first time we kind of saw a kind of a different belt in the UFC outside of the undisputed belt. Obviously, we've got the interim as well, but no, we got the BMF belt. We'd never really seen anything like this, and it was kind of exciting to see it again with Masvidal versus Diaz. The UFC did a great job at promoting it. But with that being said, it was weird how Masvidal never defended it. A lot of people didn't like the fact that Masvidal then went on to lose to Usman twice, then lose to Covington, then lose to Gilbert Burns, and in not one of the fights were the BMF belt on the line, and it kind of just disappeared. We never saw it. Well, we did see it again, but it was in a completely different division, and that was kind of it. We saw it for that fight and that fight only. So at first, it kind of just felt like a trophy. And then we've just seen Gathje beat Dustin Poirier at UFC 291. That was for the BMF belt as well, a headliner. Luckily, though, and I'll talk about this in a second, luckily, Holloway and Gaethje's for the belt. But yeah, Gathje versus Poirier kind of made sense. It was a main event for a pay-per-view. There was no belt on the line, so they kind of just had to promote it in some other way. So they kind of just introduced the BMF belt to promote the fight. And like I just said, we've now just seen Holloway and Gaethje for the BMF belt, which is an interesting fight, to be honest with you. But yeah, it shows that the BMF belt isn't just going to be a one fight and done, though. This fight shows that it's going to be, maybe if Gaethje beats Holloway and loses a title shot, maybe we're going to see the BMF belt just stick with Gaethje for a while. I'm not sure how the whole defense system is going to work or anything like that with the BMF belt, but I mean, we're seeing it again. And I feel like we're going to see a lot more contenders as well. I'll talk about Gaethje and Holloway specifically in a second, but I feel like we're going to see a lot more contenders in BMF fights now. More number one contenders, more people who are deserving of a title shot instead of just getting an immediate title shot, or instead of just, fighting another big star on a pay-per-view. I think they're going to introduce a lot more BMF fights. So we'll talk about UFC 300 now. It got announced that Gaethje versus Holloway is going to be higher on the card than Zhang Weili versus Yang Xiaonan, which is interesting because this is the first time we've seen the BMF belt on the same card as an undisputed champion, or on the same card as a different undisputed champion. And I don't mind this, to be honest with you. It shows that the BMF belt is kind of going to be treated like an undisputed belt, where if you've got the BMF belt and you're in a higher weight class than a different champion, then your fighter's going to be higher up on the card. So we're going to see the BMF title bout co-main event as well for 300, and this kind of makes me think, like, we're going to see a lot more number one contenders with the BMF belt now. Like, Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan's a good example. I could definitely see that being for, like, a BMF belt in a lightweight division. I know that Gaethje's the BMF champion, but if Gaethje weren't the BMF champion, I could definitely see this being for the BMF belt because it's a way to promote a fight that's not currently for an undisputed belt or anything like that. Like, if we look at UFC 289, and I think this is a perfect example of the use of a BMF belt. So UFC 289 was headlined by Amanda Nunes and Aldana, and the co-main event was Oliveira versus Dariush. Now, this was a terrible, this was just terrible in general because of no one would rather see Nunes versus Aldana over Oliveira and Dariush. I don't care how much of a fan you are of female fights, nobody's picking that over Oliveira and Dariush. And I feel like and I know that weren't specifically meant to happen because Oliveira was meant to be on 288, but I feel like if we were to rearrange the card and we were to give Oliveira versus Dariush the BMF belt for that specific fight, it would have made way more sense. We would have had Oliveira versus Dariush as the headliner, and then we would have had a female title fight with Nunes versus Aldana as the co-main event. It's way more promotable that way because Charles Oliveira versus Dariush is way more promotable than Nunes versus Aldana. We wouldn't have had a female headliner. It's better for the fans overall because we've got something to look forward to at the end of the card. We don't just have to see Oliveira fight, and then we don't have to keep, drag ourselves through the female fight. And it's just more intriguing overall. So if Oliveira versus Dariush was the headliner for this card, if this was the main event for this entire pay-per-view, I feel like the use of the BMF belt there would have been interesting as well. So, and it could have even counted as, like, this is what I mean, it could have been a disguised interim belt because Oliveira getting a title shot after Dariush, and I know he's just he's booked against Arman Tsarukyan, But him beating Dariush, I mean, he was scheduled to fight Islam next anyway at UFC 294, so it kind of was just a disguised interim belt if you were to use the BMF belt there. And no one wants to see a female title fight above a men's title fight, and there's some cases where that can happen, like in the flyweight division, because there's a female bantamweight belt. There's a few times where the female bantamweight champion fight might be above the flyweight fight on the pay-per-view, which is no one wants to see that. And a lot of people are against the idea of the BMF belt. A lot of people think it's just a terrible kind of promotion tool, that, you know, the fact that it was never defended by Masvidal. People just dislike the idea of a BMF belt. It's too confusing. We're turning into boxing. And to be honest, I don't blame those people, because it can be quite confusing to have a different belt, and, you know, who's going to be fighting for the BMF belt? Does it disappear if you lose, or what? You know, there's a lot of questions to be answered about the belt, but personally, I don't mind the BMF belt. I don't mind the BMF belt as long as it's kind of structured in a way that it makes sense with the whole defense system and everything like that. And to be honest, I'm going to these people, and I'm not, you know, I'm not going to, you know, advocate for the BMF champion, but I'm one of these people that wouldn't mind one BMF like belt in every division, because I feel like having a BMF belt in one division, you're kind of limiting the belt between, you know, your few fighters. Maybe if the UFC are going to use it as a promotion tool and only use it once every now and then for when they desperately need a headliner to be for a belt, or, you know, for a 5-rounder to happen, maybe that's when they're going to use it. But I feel like overall, I don't have a problem with the BMF belt. Like UFC 272 for an example, Covington versus Masvidal wasn't for a belt, wasn't for an undisputed belt, BMF belt, whatever belt you want. Wasn't for a belt at all. It was just a main event for a non-pay-per-view. Now, obviously, they had the hatred towards each other, which kind of built the card. But I feel like pay-per-view cards, and I know we only get this really on rare occasions, but pay-per-view cards without a belt, excluding McGregor, they're always viewed as kind of lower pay-per-views, you know, worse pay-per-views than the pay-per-view that's got a belt on it. And then we look at UFC 244, Masvidal versus Diaz, that had a BMF belt on the line. Because we had the introduction as the BMF belt, it got people talking about the pay-per-view. It made the pay-per-view way more exciting, and it just made the overall fight with Masvidal and Diaz way more intriguing. So I feel like the introduction of the BMF belt, it's been used in many cases and it's been good. So yeah, personally, I feel like the BMF belt as well, when a champion beats the BMF champion, I don't think the undisputed champion should get to keep the belt. I don't think that should happen. I feel like, let's say Usman was to beat Masvidal, I don't think Usman should become the BMF belt, because a lot of the cases it's just going to be a champion holding 2 belts. So I feel like the BMF belt should strictly be used in non-undisputed title fights, just because it gives non-champions a way to fight for a belt. And I don't want it to turn into boxing as well, where there's like 20 belts per weight class or anything like that, or when a champion's holding like 5 different belts. So I'm not a fan of that either. But yeah, this is my thoughts on the BMF belt. I feel like it's just going to become a disguised interim belt in the next few years. It's going to become a placeholder on cards. It's going to be used as an excuse for 2 kind of big stars who aren't fighting for a belt to be higher up on the card, above, you know, women's fights and maybe flyweight men's fights, just because of the belt itself. So that's my opinion on the BMF belt. Let me know your thoughts on it. Do you think it should stay? What do you think should happen with it? And yeah, thank you for watching.